I call the Honourable Minister Craig Foss.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I join the rest of the House in expressing our confidence in this great national-led government led by our awesome and great Prime Minister, Mr John Key. Mr Speaker, we have stable leadership over this side of the House. We continue stable leadership, and in tough times, challenging times to this country and around the world, that's what's required. And yet day after day we read about coups, about numbers, about what Mr Cunliffe may or may not be doing, challenging Mr Shearer or not. Apparently Mr Shearer has the vote tied up for the Labour caucus in a few weeks' time, but I understand he's afraid to put the vote to the entire Labour membership, which is interesting, and there's been a fair bit of commentary on that, Mr Speaker. But, Mr Speaker, there are many challenges, so I'll speak to what this government has done, what we intend to do as lined out in the Prime Minister's statement, but also I'll talk to some of the other interesting issues out there. We must remember the challenges we faced. So when this government was elected, yes, 4-ish years ago now, but we faced, remember, the decade of deficits. Recall that, because the Labour opposition and their friends, the Green opposition, are in denial, actually, of what the state of the economy, the accounts were at that time, and what the world economy was in at that time. So we had an unbalanced economy where the state sector had grown phenomenally over particularly the previous 5 years. So the state economy was suffocating out the real economy, which creates real jobs. We faced a decade of deficits. The global financial crisis was really starting to kick in. Remember, New Zealand had been in recession for 1 year prior to this government coming in at the end of the previous Labour regime, and we're having to deal with that. And of course, tragically, Mr Speaker, we're having to deal with the effect, the aftermath, and now the rebuild, of course, of the Christchurch, the Canterbury earthquakes, Mr Speaker. So when we hear the Labour opposition, the Green opposition, talking about spending or the state of the government accounts or whatever, we need to remind ourselves of the three major challenges that this government has faced down, and is continuing to deal with in spite of what's going on around the rest of the world. Those challenges are the unbalanced economy which we inherited, which takes so long to put right. A bit like an oil tanker, once we get the direction change, we're off, Mr Speaker. It's a hard job. The global financial crisis continues. This country is reliant on global capital to fund its wants, its rebuild. We need the world to try and perform a bit better than it is, but the global financial crisis is still around us, even though the opposition seems to be in denial of it. And of course, the social and economic, impact of the Christchurch, the Canterbury earthquakes still will have a large impact on the Crown, the taxpayers' accounts, for many, many years to come. Mr Speaker, but to deal with that, we've laid out 4 main priorities. Of course, we have to responsibly manage the government's accounts, or the taxpayers' finances, if you like, Mr Speaker. We have to build a more competitive and productive economy. We can't just talk about it, some like to, we have to do it, and some hard calls are needed to be made in there to build a more productive economy. Mr Speaker, we have to export, we have to grow our exports, we have to become more productive if we're to fulfil the wants of our population. And of course, we have to deliver on better public services. That sounds pretty simple stuff. That's a pretty tough job, but we've got there, Mr Speaker, in spite of flat budgets which we've had to deliver, no real growth in those budgets other than education and health over 4 years now, but we're delivering better public services. And of course, we're underway of rebuilding Christchurch. The bulldozers are underway. It's really starting to ramp up there. Of course, there are ongoing issues. Of course, there are personal tragedies, but we are getting on with the job, and I salute Jerry Brownlee for the leadership he's shown there, the personal leadership he's shown for the people of Christchurch, and of course our Prime Minister, Mr John Key. So what does that mean, though? If you're sitting at home, what does that mean? Well, the changes we've made, the challenges we've faced down, the decisions have resulted in a 12% increase in after-tax incomes for New Zealand. I.e., your take-home pay on average is up 12% over the last 5 years under this government. Under this government, 12%. Interest rates are half of what they were when we came into government, Mr Speaker. That's what the changes and the discipline we are making in the economic sense means in the household. The cost of the home mortgage is half of what it was just 4.5 years ago. It means we can afford 35,000 more elective operations, Mr. Speaker. That's what it means by better public services. It means we can afford and prioritise to have every state house insulated. In spite of the social rhetoric on the other side, this national government is insulating every single state house. That should be applauded. Mr. Speaker, we're hearing a fair bit about this hands-on rhetoric from David Shearer. We're hearing a bit about hands-on. So I think it's important to remind ourselves last time the Labour Party and their Green colleagues had their hands on the economy. Because when they had hands on Kiwi Rail, it cost the taxpayer about $1 billion, a bit of a donation essentially to an Aussie corporate. When they had hands on to the public service, there was an absolute explosion in numbers and the cost of the public service without any corresponding better outcome. When the Labour Party and the Green Party had hands-on the tax system, the tax take doubled. The highest tax rate was about 39 cents. And there was an explosion in LAQCs. An explosion in LAQCs, yet the other side, Mr Parker earlier kept talking about capital gains taxes, etc. He was part of a government responsible for that. When the Labour and Greens opposition had hands-on the health system, we had waiting lists for waiting lists for waiting lists. We had people lying in corridors of hospitals bleeding into buckets. That's when they had hands-on the health system. When they had hands-on the economic development side of things, we had things like sovereign yachts. Remember that one? 25 million just written off. That was their idea of economic development. When they had hands-on export policy, they declared an export year. That was it. Declare an export year, therefore export should grow. Didn't happen, in fact declined. When they had hands-on the levers that influence inflation, inflation was well outside the band, the top of the band of 3%. It was about 4.5% in the year leading up to this new government coming in. When the Labour government had hands-on the tools that influence interest rates for home mortgages were in double figures near 11%. They are now around 5%. That's what Labour hands-on means to the economy. When they had hands-on the education system, 20% of our kids were failed or failed within that system. Doesn't matter why, they did. But they did not do anything about it other than constantly criticise the initiatives we are making, particularly in that low of 20%, to try and improve that outcome. When the Labour Party had hands-on those things that can influence the current account, and they campaigned on it ferociously, actually, it doubled once they got into government. When they had hands-on, the current account under Labour doubled. When they had hands-on the treaty settlement process, it stalled. Stuff all happened, Mr Speaker, and a huge credit to the Honourable Mr Chris Finlayson for the effort and work he's achieved over recent years. When they had hands-on the state housing stock, Mr Speaker, 20% of that stock, about 20,000 houses, ended up dark, rotting, damp, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, the wrong size, Mr Speaker. When they had hands-on in a previous government and looking after the state assets, they flogged off about $13 billion. So we've just been lectured by one of their members about what one should or should not do regarding leveraging of the balance sheet on state assets. Yeah, I presume that was the lessons that government learned when they sold without any caveats, without any controls, without any, regardless of who the buyer was, offer onshore, they sold about $13 billion of state assets when they had hands-on the economy, Mr Speaker. One thing, Mr Speaker, what this government is doing, every change we try to make to try and address some of the issues in this economy, the Labour government oppose. The Labour opposition oppose, the Green opposition oppose. They constantly oppose. And there's one in particular in my area of Hawke's Bay which they are opposing. The water storage project, which the Labour Party seems, I'd like clarification, to be opposing. Because that is about a 3% growth in Hawke's Bay, longer jobs, longer season for jobs, longer processing, better farming, better cropping, more certainty from your farmer, your farm worker to your port worker in Napier. The Labour opposition and I definitely know the Green opposition is opposing about a $200 to $250 million investment in Hawke's Bay, Mr Speaker. I'm very interested to find out exactly where the Labour opposition stand. Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm enjoying working as part of this stable leadership, hard-working national government.